In the summer of 1969, two neighboring nations went to war. Not over land, not over oil, over a football match. This is the story of the football war, one of the strangest, most terrifying events in sporting history. A conflict that lasted exactly 100 hours. A conflict that left thousands dead. And a conflict that began with a World Cup qualifier nobody was supposed to care about. To understand what happened, you have to understand the world these two countries were living in. El Salvador in the 1960s was a powder keg. Small country, massive population, a handful of wealthy families owned nearly all the farmland, while millions of ordinary Salvadorans had nothing. No land, no future, so they crossed the border into Honduras, a bigger country with more land and fewer people. Over 20 years, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans quietly settled there, farming land that nobody else was using. But Honduras had its own problems, a military government struggling to hold power, an economy in decline, politicians who needed someone to blame, and there were the Salvadorans, strangers on Honduran soil, the perfect target. In 1969, the Honduran government began expelling Salvadoran migrants by force. Families who had lived there for decades were driven from their homes. Some were killed. El Salvador called it genocide. Then came the football. June 8, 1969, Tegucigalpa, Honduras, the first World Cup qualifier. The Salvadoran team arrived the night before the match and never slept. Honduran fans surrounded their hotel, throwing rocks, firecrackers, launching air horns through the night. Sleep-deprived and shaken, El Salvador lost 1-0. Back home in San Salvador, an 18-year-old girl named Emilia Bolaños watched the defeat on television. Then she walked to her father's desk, picked up his pistol, and shot herself through the heart. The Salvadoran press called her a martyr. The president himself attended her funeral. The entire national football team marched behind her coffin. That is the temperature we are dealing with. 1 week later, June 15th, the second match now in San Salvador. This time, it was the Honduran team that spent a sleepless night. Fans outside their hotel burning rubbish, waving rags instead of the Honduran flag in open mockery. El Salvador won 3-0. Outside, riots erupted. Salvadoran migrants in Honduras were attacked. Homes were burned. People were killed. El Salvador severed diplomatic relations with Honduras the very same day. With each team having won one match, FIFA ordered a deciding third game on neutral ground in Mexico City. June 26th. The stadium was surrounded by armed guards. El Salvador won 3-2 after extra time. They had qualified for the World Cup, and 3 weeks later, they went to war. July 14th, 1969. Salvadoran jets crossed into Honduran airspace. Ground forces followed. The invasion had begun. For 100 hours, these two countries, sharing a language, a religion, a culture, tore each other apart. The world watched, stunned. Even more bizarre, the aircraft fighting above the jungle were propeller-driven relics from World War II. This was the last aerial dogfight between piston-engine warplanes in human history. The Organization of American States forced a ceasefire on July 18th, but the damage was done. Somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 people were dead. 50,000 were homeless. 300,000 Salvadorans had been expelled from Honduras. The two countries would not sign a formal peace treaty for another 11 years. El Salvador did make it to the 1970 World Cup. They lost every single match and failed to score a single goal. They had won the war that started the war, and they had nothing to show for it. The football war is not really a story about football. It is a story about What happens when desperate people, reckless governments, and a frenzied press collide, and how sport, the thing we love most, can become the match that lights the fuse. History has a dark sense of humour, and sometimes it scores in extra time.